Okay, so Adam Frank is a leading expert on how stars form and how they die. He loves big things that go bang, right? And makes he makes big numerical models of how that works. He's also committed to exploring the proper context of science and culture. He's the co-founder of the National Public Radio's 13.7 Cosmos and Culture blog, now defunct, which ran for 8 years, and he's a regular on-air commentator for All Things Considered and contributes quite occasionally, I would say almost frequently, to the New York Times as an op-ed writer. He's the author of 3 books: The Constant Fire, Beyond the Science and Religion Debate, About Time, Cosmology and Culture at the Twilight of the Big Bang, and more recently, Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth, which I would call as a manifesto for our survival from the light of the new science of astrobiology. He's also the author of a textbook called Astronomy at Play in the Cosmos. So Adam, thanks.
So it is a great pleasure to be here. We've had 3 talks, and I thought they were all awesome and very useful and helpful. So the title of my talk is The Cosmological Dinosaur, which I hope will become more apparent, the meaning of that as we go along. You know how like now with Star Wars, they're spinning off, and then there's like, Han Solo, a Star Wars story. Well, so Evan gave such a good introduction to the blind spot. This is sort of, some of this I'm going to be repeating what he said, and I hope not too much. But it's, my own take on it, and particularly raising some issues that were particularly cogent for me as the 3 of us tried to formulate our idea of the blind spot. In the beginning, the blind spot actually began 2 years ago with discussions amongst us and ended up with this article. But I wanted to show this picture. This is a picture of the blackboard in Marcelo's office where we were, trying to keep track of what was going on, and I had to, because I knew it was going to get erased, take pictures of it. So this is actually sort of the birth of the 3 of us talking about it. And you see also here the idea, begin with the parable of the camera on the wall. And what I'm actually, so this is what I'm both going to be presenting my take on the blind spot, but also raising this question, which Evan, I think you addressed to some degree, but it's still, I need to talk with you more about it. It's this general question of, as a physicist, I want to know about the world in and of itself. And, as I think it was William James said, all philosophy is temperament. And throughout my life, I've been bothered. I've wanted the world in and of itself, but I've been bothered by the idea of the world in and of itself. And as I've gotten older, I always call myself a lapsed Platonist. I've become convinced that is not really a meaningful idea. So, to begin in the beginning, or at least a good beginning to place this talk, last semester I was teaching cosmology to my graduate students, and we were going through the cosmic microwave background radiation and the models for it. So up there is that beautiful Planck data. These are fluctuations in the cosmic microwave background. And one can make a theory of a plasma of 300,000 years after the beginning of the universe. You have a cosmic plasma at a temperature of like 3,000, 4,000 degrees, and you can do models of that plasma, and then you can make predictions for a particular. You have to transform this thing. You take this data and you pass it through. You create what's called a power spectrum of it on different size scales, fluctuations on this size, that size, etc. And what you end up with, these little red dots there, right? So that's the data. You've taken the data, you've digested it, you've massaged it, you've vomited it back out in a particular form. And then the model is the green line, and you see how remarkably the model, which is a model of an expanding space-time with this plasma in it that's having all these interactions going on, sound waves in the plasma, and boom, it just nails it, right? The model and the data just completely overlap. And so, you look at this, and of course I tell my students, like, wow, this is a triumph of science. And of course, I'm doing this while we're writing this article, and so then the question, of course, comes up to me. Well, first, let me just tell you a little bit more about what's in it. So the model, in order to do the model, especially for a graduate course, you have this plasma made of neutrons and neutrinos and photons and protons and electrons, and you've got to specify all of their different interactions, in order to get that confluence of the data and the model. And then you have to work out all of these what are called distribution functions for how the different particles, how many of the different particles there are as they're interacting. So it's a very complicated piece of machinery. So, it's a triumph, hooray, I have to take this very complicated model, compare it with the very complicated data. And of course, it led me to ask, well, what was it like? What was it like to be there? Which is also a stand-in for is this really true? Was the universe really like this 300,000 years after the birth of, of creation? To what degree are my models, and these very complicated models of plasma dynamics 300,000 years after the Big Bang, to what degree are they actually telling me about reality? How do they represent reality? So, in some sense, this question is, what is the relationship between, and here's a very explicit example, between scientific truths that I get out of the data and out of my very complicated model, and the world in itself. Because in this case, the world in itself, it is conjuring in my imagination, an image of the world of itself that is so radical compared to the world, to my life world, as we're saying. Right? So that is the question I'm sort of addressing in this talk. How I feel about that, how I think we should think about that, or the problems that lie in it. And of course, this is really about what is the world like without us, which is, of course, I think every important philosophical question can be reduced to something you said as a kid, or when you were a 13-year-old, which is if a tree fell in the forest and no one was around here. It's amazing, actually, how much this question actually is embodied in that. So I love, almost every talk, I always show this picture. This is a book. I think, Marcelo, you have an article in this. It's a book from some conference, but I just love the title, right? Science and ultimate reality, right? You have to have reverb on that when you say it, right? And it's just so, the assumptions built into that it's just so amazing, right? Science at science, because what's in here is what I would call the usual answer. If you want to know about is these models really telling us the truth about the world 300,000 years after the moment of creation? Yes, because of scientific realism. Physics, in particular, provides an account of nature at its deepest basal levels, and that it is independent of us, right? So science actually, the dream of physics I came into it with, why I wanted to do it, was, I was going to get the basal structure. I was going to know it. I was going to be able to think God's thoughts in some sense. Which is what that experience of wow, why not for my students, writing out those equations and being like, my God, these really seem to work. So how accurate is that? That's the question I want to raise. So what do I mean by basal structures? Well, physics, especially now, we've been pushing for a while to the next level beyond the enormous triumph of the 20th century. So we have things like supersymmetry, which tries to take all the particles that we have now in what's called the standard model and go to the next level and understand why the standard model has the form that it does. So that's in some sense, on the way towards a basal structure. A true basal structure is this, very long now, 50-year search for trying to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity, which really just don't want to talk to each other, okay? And there's the feeling that, once we get to the small enough scales, gravity, general relativity, which is a continuous theory, has continuous fields, has to be quantized. And so that, when we figure out how to quantize space and time, how to break space and time into little chunks, that will be a basal structure. This is why you get things, the idea of a theory of everything, the dream of that. So these are examples of basal structures, and inherent in this sort of image of science as providing for us ultimate reality, a vision of, an account of ultimate reality, is often a reductionist, materialist, and perhaps physicalist view. I just put physicalism in question marks there because sometimes I hear versions of physicalism which I'm not as much put off by. But certainly reductionism and materialism I am. And what is the secret for this? It's that everything we see is basically composed of smaller parts, whether they are particles or fields. There are going to be ultimate smaller parts, right? That's why that book said, Science and Ultimate Reality. When we find the ultimate laws of these ultimate smallest parts, then we will have the basal structures, and we will have, the dream of physics. We will have a theory of everything. And what's most important is that no emergent laws are needed at higher levels of structure. Basically, if you have the basal structures, you can work your way up. in principle, if not in practice, right? So, Sean Carroll, who I would kind of consider to be a reductionist materialist, but his point would be like, well, it's the most boring question ever asked about whether or not you can reproduce, brains from atoms, because essentially you can't, but in principle you should be able to. Now, people have said here a number of times, it's sort of like, well, there are philosophers who don't really believe, there are some philosophers and physicists who say this, but that's not the way that's done. And I appreciate that the people, a couple of people have said that, but I have to say how much I encounter this among my colleagues. Like, this is the default position for a large fraction of my colleagues, including vehement resistance if you challenge this, at the deepest levels. And you can see this in the debates about quantum mechanics, right? The realist versus anti-realist position, that people become deeply offended if you, sort of can challenge this. So, I mean, it's good. I think what I'm really interested in having the conversations that we have today, because, there are clearly, you could be in opposition to this and not take our position, right? Because there are subtle ways to think about this. But I just want to say, this is it seems to me, my experience has been, this has been a very entrenched view and continues to be a very entrenched view. Okay, so now I want to talk a little about the problems with this view. I very much see physics as having a, kind of ontological mania. We want the furniture in God's waiting room. That's really what we're about. It's what gives us a sense of why we're doing this. And so that's why the objective frame we're so concerned with, or have such a visceral attachment to the objective frame. Because what we want is the objective world. We want to know what the world without us. And as has been part of my problem with this is, as Nagel points out, that this is a view from nowhere. When you often ask people about the objective view, some people will argue, someone will argue with me about what we're saying with the blind spot, and they'll say, what about a planet a million light years away? What about that planet? You say that planet doesn't exist? And I'll say, well, tell me about that planet, right? And what you find is they're actually imagining themselves kind of floating over the planet, disembodied, looking down on it, right? They still have a perspective as if they're looking out of the head, but their head is invisible, right? So part of my problem with the objective view is that you still have a perspective, but you've just sort of erased yourself. So it is very much, a view from nowhere, and is, again, this leads back to what we've been talking about, for the last few hours. It is a view, it is a kind of time that has no duration. It is not lived time, and it's space without location, in Heidegger's sense of Dasein. That, one of the things that really defines being a human being is that, you're there. You have a there. You're a spotlit, lit up place in being. So what I would say about this is the objective frame, which is so much, kind of as I say, the visceral desire of so much of physics, is both fundamentally unexperienced and fundamentally unexperientiable. And in that sense, it's incoherent, right? So it's something that we physicists become very tied to from an early age, but when you really try to look at it, you find that there's nothing in it. It can't, it's not, it doesn't cohere with our actual experience of reality. So what does it mean to hold that view? If we're interested in reality, which is what this conference is about, it's appearing. Right? It's ability to appear to us or disclose or to be disclosed or revealed, and these are phenomenological terms, is an essential attribute, right? I can't get away from being alive until I'm dead, and then who knows what happens, right? But every morning I can't stop the world from appearing to me, but making itself manifest. And that is such an essential part of the weirdness or what it means to be alive, that if we're interested in reality, then any models of or any discussions of reality, appearing, disclosing, revealing, we have to acknowledge there's only one place / time it appears or that happens, and that's with you. You now here. And so in some sense, the fundamental question to be answered about reality has to be, what is this appearing, disclosing, and revealing? Okay, so in that sense, we can take a picture of M87, but from this sort of sense, reality, and again, I'm talking about this, the fundamental aspects of reality for us is this appearing. Reality doesn't appear at M87, it appears for us taking a picture of M87. And that doesn't mean that M87 doesn't exist. It's just, if we're really interested in the nature of reality, that is, this disclosing, this centrality of presence has got to be a central question. So there's also an ethical consideration, I would say, that comes into thinking about the problems with the reductionism and materialism, and that it's basically a dead world, right? It's a world that life would never know life, right? As I think you said, life couldn't recognize life if it was just reductionism. It's a world that really essentially has no sense, no intelligibility, no presence, and that has consequences, right? Because what has happened in one of the problems I think with the social constructivist model, when in the 90s when people were arguing, oh, science is just a game that people invent, it's not the rules, there's nothing to it, was that it made a mistake, which was that science is this incredibly powerful way we have of both describing the world and controlling it, and the powerful adopted it, right? It became a mechanism to build weapons, to generate wealth. And so, science was embraced for lots of reasons, and it became so successful in some sense that it became part of the general social discourse, such that you ended up with what is sometimes called scientism, which is that ultimately the only truths that matter are scientific truths, and our culture is rife with this. It's the idea that love, you feel love, yeah, sure, love is kind of true, but really ultimately it's just chemicals, right? I sat in, I think it was this lecture hall, with Marcelo 2 years ago, with a woman who was giving a lecture about, she had a company called Affecta, which was using computational, emotional computing, right? So you could produce, she wanted to produce computers that could recognize your emotions by your facial, like whether, the N1 muscle in your cheek was raised or lowered, because that could be identified with, emotional states. There's been psychological work with that. And so, build and deploy computers for which emotions are just these states, right? And so this is the way in which this sort of, emotions, whatever the internal reality or truth of emotions, gets flattened into whatever you can measure, because that's all that matters, is what can be measured. So, there's scientism, sort of disallows any other kinds of truths in culture to, great detriment. And I'm even going to point here to, I don't want to stretch it too far, but this is one of the reasons we wrote the article, is that also this can be associated with sort of the ravages of late-stage consumer capitalism, and the fact that, we've known about climate change for how long now, and we're just unable to deal with it, right? We're just unable to marshal the capacity to deal with it. And I think this is in some way because, we just can't deal in any way other than numbers, because sort of the numbers and the scientific, the scientistic view, not the scientific view, because science obviously has shown that climate change is happening, but that there are ethical considerations to the triumph of the reductionist materialist view. Okay, and there's also a new imperative, I think, for physics and philosophy with pushing away from that view, which is that really we're having trouble with physics right now. I mean, if I call it a crisis in physics, you don't have to listen to me because, hey, here's the Scientific American article with the title, The Crisis in Physics. When it comes to fundamental physics, the earliest parts of the Big Bang, quantum gravity, we have run out of steam in a lot of ways. I won't go into that in detail, but I think there's reasons to at least ask what other approaches might be useful, other metaphysical approaches that might be useful, because the current metaphysical approach, the underlying metaphysics, has sort of, stalled in some sense. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to think about alternatives, and when I'm thinking about that, what I want to ask is the question that Stephen Hawking asked: what breathes fire into the equations, right? So yeah, you can have this materialist reductionist view, and all there are your equations, and the equations, govern everything, but what, as Hawking was asking, where's the animation, so to speak? So my answer is the verb to be is what's missing from, what breathes fire into the equation. So in the verb to, this stresses the active quality of this. And there's a lot of different words that go for this that you can, and that's the, the difficulty here is to try and capture some part of this appearing and disclosing, being, presence, perspective, participation, self-luminosity. And all of these verbs point to something that is, it's trying not to have an inside and outside, trying not to sort of make this distinguishing between the inside, the inside of the head and the outside. There's reality, and then there's just information processing machinery up here. So the alternative approach for me is that experience is irreducible. Like if we're looking for what's irreducible, what's the basal structure, it's experience itself, right? That's sort of, and that the blind spot is the science's inability to recognize that experience is the beginning. Now some of this, I don't need to go over this in a great deal of detail because we've talked about it before, but I do want to point out, that in many ways the whole point of, when we talk about science, the idea of science and ultimate reality, the question there really comes down to how do we situate experience inside of physics, right? Okay, I want to have a physical model for reality, and I'm going to somehow figure out how experience occurs in my physical model. But for me, I think the more important or interesting question is how do we situate physics within the totality and unity of experience? Because that unity is something that is going to be very important to me. All right, so I don't need to go into phenomenology. It's been talked about before, but I think there's two perspectives I think are going to be important on this. One of them is phenomenology, and we've talked about the life world. Heidegger, for all of his difficulty because he was such a coward in his life, I still think there's a great deal in his philosophy that was useful, particularly the idea of Dasein, of that that we are the lit up place in being. And it's recognizing life, world, and Dasein as a prerequisite for all that we do in the kind of scientific and Newtonian notions. So I won't go through this in great detail. How much time do I have left?
You're good.
Good.
15 minutes.
Okay, good. The thing that's important for phenomenology for me is the primacy of perspective. I think there are two essential truths that it reveals. The first is that there's no escape from perspective. That's why I sort of told that story about the perspectiveless, the sort of the non-coherence of the perspectiveless perspective, right? So when people are attaching themselves to this idea of objectivity, not objectivity as, we can all agree on something. That's the correct use of objectivity. And I think that's sort of what you were talking about before. But the idea of the objective world, the world without us, which is, as I said, I think holds a very a strong gravitational pull for physicists. That the first is the recognition that you can't escape from perspective or experience. And the other part that's really important that I also want to emphasize here is the idea of experience as a totality, the inseparability of experience. That you can't atomize it. That it's a unity that can only be ignored for so long, right? So in some sense, I'm not against the idea of the objective frame because it proved to be so useful. It was really being able to say, look, I've got a box on a table, I want to ignore everything else, in the world and just focus on what's going on in that box. That was very powerful, allowed us to make huge strides. But as we probe deeper, there are clearly going to be some places, particularly self-referential places, where self-reference becomes important, that you can't ignore the fact that it's a unity, right? You can only have separations for so long, and this comes to the issue of boundary conditions. You see this in cosmology with the great problem with boundary conditions, right? You can't have a model of cosmology without specifying boundary conditions, what was happening, at the beginning of the Big Bang, and those boundary conditions, you need very specific ones. If you don't tune them exactly the way they need to be tuned, you don't get this universe. So I think that's a general kinds of a problem for certain kinds of scientific problems. Consciousness probably one of them as well. So what's important to identify is how this process occurs, how science works within the phenomenological setting, and this is why Michelle's work has been so important to me. So a couple of quotes here. The creators of objective knowledge become so impressed by its efficacy that they tend to forget or to minimize that conscious experience is its starting point and its permanent requirement. So that is an essential step that I think Evan articulated very well. And then the part for me that became interesting, especially thinking in terms of physics, is they minimize the long historical process by which contents of experience have been carefully selected, differentiated, and impoverished to distillate their universal fraction as a structure. I really love this for two reasons, right? What it says is you start out with just the life world, right? And then somehow, it's our nature, or the nature of developing science, is that we're sort of able to pull certain aspects of the life world to isolate them and focus on them and sort of like extrude some aspect of them, that's the distillates, into something that you could do science on, right? But in the process, you're going to impoverish it, right? So that's I think that's what I was connecting to with the ethical structures. You are going to deaden the world. You're going to impoverish the phenomena by doing this. You will gain great boons by doing it, but there will also be an impoverishment. So I think somewhere in this paper or one of the other papers, Michelle talks about structural invariance. Temperature, right? We all have this fundamental experience of being cold, right? But there's a bunch of steps that takes being cold and turns it into this thing called temperature, which we can all universally measure because we figured out how to build the equipment. And then here's this very complex electronic thermometer, right? So it's the pulling out of the identification of the structural invariants and pulling them out and then turning them into the scientific discourse, which is, it's very important to recognize how that happens, to understand what the relationship is between the reality or the truths, let's put it that way, the truths of science and the truths of the more fundamental truths of lived experience. And so I want to recommend, along those lines, I think it's really important, this new book by Robert Crease, The Workshop and the World, which I think is I'm just reading it now, is fascinating, because he's going through sort of how this whole process happened. So for him, the workshop was this process that Francis Bacon first identified of like, look, you're going to isolate the world, you're going to have a special place where you're going to go and interrogate the world in special ways, right? And so science is what happened, the scientific viewpoint, scientific truths come out of the workshop. But what he identifies by looking at all of these different thinkers is how the workshop would be situated in the world and how it would gain authority and maintain authority in relationship to the world. So that's why all of our scientific truths we have to have a recognition of we need an account of the complexity of the social structures which allow scientific truths to be generated. That's not to take a social constructivist view, which is to say that these truths aren't true, but you need to understand the structures in which they're allowed to be generated so you can understand how they're generated and what the relationship is to the lived world. So particularly that science or scientific truths are generated in these very specialized workshops, which are supported via governments and also maintained via complex bureaucracies, international agreements, etc., so that the truths of the workshop become part of, they're very deeply embedded in the culture. So that helps us understand sort of how not to be fooled in some sort, not to be taken in by the reductionist materialist view. So part of this is to recognize, to see what Michelle was talking about, is to recognize the great distance that there is now between, science as the division that most, I think, scientists we have in our head, right, of scientific truth, right, which is Galileo watching, the pendulum swinging in the church when he realized, that you could use the law of pendulums, right? That's the vision we have, like, oh yeah, scientists, I just look at something and I figure it out, and there it is, I have a scientific truth. Compared to this, right, which took how many people, and how much money, and how much time, and the distance between, well, first of all, even to make this damn image, right? But then to translate it into these models. There's such a distance now between between what happens in the workshop, right? The activity of the workshop, and then the model of, my plasma 300,000 years after the Big Bang, that, it's not this sort of symbol, I just looked at it, and I watched something swing in the church, and there it is, I found my model of reality. I think it's really important to understand the sort of Bit-Boolean, how the structural invariants cascade through this, and how they manifest themselves in what now we have models of reality that are very far from just direct experience. Okay, so the second place I would identify alternatives, to the reductionist model and an approach to experience is in what I would call classical Indian and Asian philosophy, SAIP, right? So, my contention is, and now, you guys may beat me up about this, I'm now getting into really the dangerous territory. But when you look at the different cores of civilization, the Western core had developed in philosophy relatively weak methodologies for investigating first-person subjective experience. And I don't believe that's true for the eastern cores of India and China. So, here's a list of some philosophers. For various reasons, I've ended up reading more than I thought I would over my life. But for them, I think was a much greater emphasis on first-person experience. That it was, much more of interest to them. So, for example, when you think about essential concerns, what were the essential concerns of sort of the Western philosophical tradition and the essential concerns of the traditions in India and Asia? And you see this sort of in Vasubandhu, 30 verses on Yogacara. There was this great emphasis. Yogacara is sometimes called mind only, but it's not idealism in any way. It was an attempt to sort of really understand, sort of unpack the primacy of experience. Again, this sort of you can't get away from perspective. It wasn't saying that there was only mind, but saying that really the only way we apprehend the world is through experience. And from that came up, with this recognition of the fundamental emptiness of experience. And that was something that you see, this idea of emptiness, which I don't see as deeply in Western philosophy. It's there in places, but is all over Indian and Asian philosophy, particularly form and emptiness is such a central idea of Zen. And you can say, so there's things there that I think are really useful for us if we're trying to unpack, try to approach experience as a new category for us in thinking about science in the world. So what is emptiness? As I'm saying, good luck with that, right? This is one of the, you can spend a zillion koans on this. This is a very, it's not an easy idea to grasp, but because part of it is that, much in this tradition, I would argue, people are maybe beating me up on this, but it comes from also, a contemplative practice where there was some attempt to have, a more direct investigation of it. It was also scholarly, and it was also, text and reasoning, but some part of it also included contemplative practice. I think the good translation for it is boundarylessness. It's not emptiness in some kind of quantum vacuum. It's the idea that there's no boundaries. That, what we define, we have lots of conceptual boundaries, right? This is a table, that's a blackboard. But from this point of view, there was, those are just labels. And that fundamentally, in the question of form and emptiness, what there really is, there are no boundaries between things, And that's, for me, speaks to this idea of the unitary nature, the unity that is experience, that the life world is a totality. And I think, in some sense, the emphasis on form and emptiness, which was boundarylessness, recognized that. And in this way, I think actually this is an interesting way. It has connections to network theory and complexity science, which fundamentally try and take, the network as a whole, as opposed to the individual parts. Another part is a fundamental concern is Western traditions tend to really favor the absolute, right? Whereas in the Asian and Indian philosophy, the relationship between the relative and the absolute is like sort of, the ultimate reality that physics was what was hoping for, but the relative is, us, your personal, your individual experience. That, the West tended to really want the absolute. Plato's doctrine of ideals, Hegel, and the absolute. The relative, and always the relative, the personal, is some kind of lesser, crappy version of the absolute. And this is the point. For Heidegger, this was a mistake. This was philosophy forgetting about the question of being. But in the, for example, one of my favorite texts on the Sendokai, the harmony of the relative and the absolute from Zen. Ordinary life fits the absolute as a box to its lid. The absolute works together with the relative like two arrows meeting in midair. For these thinkers, there was a real serious attempt, it seems to me, to understand how the two were intermixed, right? Without favoring one or the other. It's a mistake it was not solipsism, it was a mistake to favor, it was not idealism. You didn't want to favor the individual or just mind, and neither did you want to favor, some sort of external absolute. It was the, trying to come to an active integration or active engagement with the two of them together was the point. So this obviously has relationship to philosophies of mind, both phenomenology and the SIAP, the classical Indian and Asian philosophies. For me, reconfigure the question of mind in the world. experience, so from this, what I get, experience is not consciousness, right? It's not a thing. We have this sort of idea of saying, oh, consciousness is this thing we want to explain. Where is consciousness? It changes it because it's experience that you're interested in, right? And experience is this totality. It's not a thing in the world, and it cannot be atomized into qualia. I have great objections to the idea of qualia based on both phenomenology and my experience with and that's why embodiment is such an important idea, I think. The more I learn about embodiment, the more I just find it super useful. Experience requires you and the world together. It's like they're joined, and thou shalt not separate them. It's a totality. This dichotomy between like, oh, I got inside my head, and then there's the world out there. That may be useful for certain things, but actually it's a mistake, right? To see it that way. And so I love this story that Evan tells about Bates and Salk having a conversation where I think Bateson asks Salk, where is consciousness? And Salk says, in here. And Bateson says, no, it's out here, right? Meaning that, there's your consciousness doesn't end at your head. How could it, right? You're embodied in the world. It's not like you're not a Boltzmann brain floating in space, right? I mean, that's sort of, for me, some of the ridiculousness of the whole Boltzmann brain idea. Now, I'm also going to say there's a place here for contemplative practice. I think, this might get me into a lot of trouble. But, the philosophical lineage beginning with Plato was sort of introspectively impoverished. It was very outwardly focused, and I think this has to do, in some sense, because of eventually what would become monotheism, that it got picked up by, Catholicism. There's a desire to talk about mind, but no first-person craft or technique to examine mind. Because, of course, I think one of the things that came out of these more contemplative traditions was there was some sense that, very rapidly with contemplative practice, you see that mind, thoughts are just the upper layer of, they're the pond scum floating on the top of experience, and there are much, much deeper levels. So contemplative practice was one tool among others, I think, that was more widely and institutionally deployed in the classical Indian and Asian philosophies. And I think the important point here is the stabilization of attention, right? One of the problems with dealing with experience, right? It's such a, it's sand in your fingers. What are we talking about when we're talking about experience, right? It's so hard to identify what it means. And one of the reasons why contemplative practice becomes at least part of this discussion is the capacity to stabilize attention. Right? To be able to have attention be the object of your attention and its dynamics. Because without that, you're just at the whim of whatever you're thinking, and that's why they tend, I think, philosophers who have been doing, self-examination tend to focus on their thoughts. Without the ability to stabilize attention, you can't sort of go to the next level to see sort of where the dynamics of thoughts are rising, and then the dynamics below that. All right, and of course, quantum mechanics, right? We can't, so I love Chris gave a great talk on this. It's been the important thing for me about quantum mechanics is 100 years of having this unbelievably powerful theory and not knowing at all what it's telling us, right? What it means. And so, we have this long-standing debate between realists versus anti-realists. So the realists are people who believe in things like, that we'll take on many worlds or pilot wave interpretation versus, the Copenhagen interpretation or cubism or participatory realism. And the thing that always strikes me about the people who call themselves realists is the degree, because they want to preserve the realism of their equations, of the dynamical equations, the length to which they're willing to go in terms of accepting the reality of things, these incredibly abstract entities, like an infinity of universes splitting off every time a measurement is made. Or, I was just reading Lee Smollin's book where he's advocating for the pilot waves. And yes, in the pilot, at least if I understand it, the pilot waves, you get, the cat actually, the particles of the cat being in one place, hooray, but you still are left with a wave, a hyperdimensional wave, extending through space that still has the part where the cat's alive. That's still there, right? It didn't go away. So, in order to preserve realism, you now have these waves that still exist everywhere. They're real in the sense that they want, tables and chairs to be real. And it seems like that's your realism. I mean, you're still stuck with, something, you're still left with weirdness. And what I like about cubism is that it's still, or participatory realism, it preserves the realistic part, right? What's realistic is the world I'm in, right? And so it's not asking to imbue the world, okay, I'm just about done. It's not asking to add to the world all of these really strange theoretical constructs to preserve this need to have ultimate reality, right? Which is the reason why the many worlds what they want in the many worlds interpretation is to preserve ultimate reality. So perhaps, and I think this came in Chris's talk, what quantum mechanics is really exposing is the dynamics of the structural invariance. That the rules, the Born rule, is in fact what it's showing us is how the structural invariance manifest themselves or become possible. And in that way, that's just as exciting as having, that's just as ultimate reality to me as having, the many worlds interpretation. Okay, so this is kind of a summary. To go beyond the blind spot, it would be an account of science and science's truth that begins with the irreducibility of experience. And that means it is enacted, it is embodied, it has boundarylessness, and an account of other truth domains, other places where there are human truths. The arts, philosophy, and I'm going to include spiritual endeavor in this as well. These are truths, and they don't reduce down to science. They're not just, it's just your neurology, that's it, ultimately. So in some sense, love does not reduce to neurochemicals, even though neurochemicals are nonetheless part of it, right? It's being able to balance those two. So I think that's just about, if I had to codify it, where's the dinosaur? Well, so what was the cosmological dinosaur part? I won't go through this in detail right now, but I still have a question for me is still, what did you call it, the ancestral? Ancestral questions still bother me, right? I still need to know, but weren't the dinosaurs here? So that's a question I still need to ask people. But here's my codification of the problem, right? If the whole question was, what about the world without us? My codification is clearly there is a world without us, right? We're contingent beings, but clearly it's not this one, right? This is the world of experience, right? And so this is where science happens. This is where the scientific accounts occur. So that's the way I sort of parse it, whether it's useful or not. Thank you very much.
Since this is the last talk, we do have time for
I gotta go, sorry.
or maybe a question. Peter?
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to what you said about that there's no escape from perspective, so the objective frame is unexperienceable.
Yeah.
Right? Contrasting your take on the objective frame with Janan's take on the objective frame, it seems you take a position like Janan's, then the objective frame represents all the possible loci of experiences are right in there, right? They're in that description, right? All the little possible you are here signs, right? So I'm not sure why, in what sense the objective frame is unexperienceable.
Well, so I'm interested in talking exactly about that, because actually what I found in your view was perhaps, there may be ways of reconciling, though I'm not sure. But I would still, I think, argue that, because I was wondering about your idea of fixed points, right, that these are fixed points. Because in some sense, these are still representations of, right, they're abstractions from the, my perspective. There is no perceived perspective, I think, in some sense. They are, they're maps, right? They're maps, and you explicitly include maps, which I thought was really interesting. But then the question is, I'm not a map, right? I mean, that's the hard part. That enacted, embodied, appearing. Again, the idea of appearing. So, but that's why, again, I think I was happy for the talk. I think there's lots of discussions to have here. But it still seems to me that the enacting, appearing, revealing is not there.
Yeah, that's right. So that I point to that Donald Carey Williams quote where he says, so your objection is basically that the representation isn't the experience.
Right.
Well, of course it's not necessarily so.
Yeah, but except what I very much liked your, as I said, both of you guys who are our opponents in some sense are very reasonable. We need some unreasonable people here. We need Tim Malden here. I love that picture of Tim you had where you just seemed really angry. Because I think there are many philosophers and physicists who would take a much more strident view than you're taking, because they would say there is no experience, right? I mean, in some sense, right? You know, consciousness unexplained, right? Consciousness dismissed, right? You know, so it's like, I think there is a real strong stream in people who talk about this that wants to make, actually, there is no such thing as that revealedness. They'd be like, what are you even talking about, revealedness, disclosure? This is what they'll say about phenomenology, that it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, you know? So.
Since you mentioned Janan's there, sorry,
You know, just a question about methodology. I mean, sort of one of the
I'm not sure I have one.
Well, I mean, about the way to approach these questions. I mean, one of the things has to be separating sort of criticisms of the imaginative metaphors that we use to try to give content to sort of scientific models, because we are experiencing beings. We will always try to picture things in the head,
Right.
and that means making an object of them. And you know, so we do that with space-time, for example. We want to look down, take a bird's eye view, so we construct this sort of point of view. But the real content of the objective view, it's not a point of view. There is no point outside of space-time from which we can see it. And so much of the difficulty that people have with making sense of it is because they're irresistibly trying to give it imaginative content, and that forces us into this position. So I think if there's going to be any chance of making sense of the kind of what the real content of the scientific worldview is supposed to be, it's to separate out criticisms of those imaginative metaphors. One of which is precisely, well, it's inexperienceable, so it's empty. There's no content to it. So I guess, you know,
Well, that's what I thought, you know, sort of our little conversation earlier about different kinds of logics, you know, that can sort of reveal, you know, this idea of, I forgot the term you used, it's what was it, we're like, you know, you have it's the paradox you also brought up. You know, are there ways of sort of reconciling that paradox?
relations of mutual inclusion.
Yeah, relations of mutual inclusion, right. Because, you know, what's very interesting is that you see so many of the places that science got itself into trouble was self-referentiality. Richardson's paradox, you know, Gödel's theorem sort of appears out of it. That self-referentiality, you know, in general leads to paradox. And so if there are ways, and I feel like what we're talking about here is sort of a class of that. So if there are ways of you know, finding ways of dealing with that, then it could be very helpful. Because I want there to be content in this ultimately, right? It shouldn't just be phenomena. You know, there in some sense there has to be something to do, you know, with these approaches.
It's funny though that the true space-time is four-dimensional, but we of course can't experience that, so we create maps which are two-dimensional.
Yeah, projectile.
So it's kind of a funny paradox there, that you can't really experience a four-dimensional space-time, so you compress it to one or two spatial dimensions to get that.
But you can experience it from within.
From
You
within.
can't look at it.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that's the
Yeah, right. One last question, just because it's my life. At least not yet.
Thanks, this is a very intriguing and lively talk. I really enjoyed it a lot. I want to go back to your first slide, which feels like there was so, or maybe it was your second slide, there was so much to unpack, and I love your honesty when you said, you know, so here's the model, right, which is basically the scientist's story, right, or the theory, and then there's the data, which we massage, I forgot your wonderful verb, we massage, we digest, and we regurgitate. Because this idea, right, of boundarylessness, I think even breaks down a little bit, if I'm understanding what you're saying, the boundary between the model and the data, because the scientist's hands are all over and stories are all over the data, right? Because it's not just some pure thing that you're comparing to your story or your model or your theory. It's, okay, it doesn't fit there. Let me draw the line there. Let me put the boundary here and see if that fits better. So things start to break down, it seems like. I mean, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a philosopher. So there may be some conceptual leap that I'm missing here, but I'd love to have you, just because you were so honest about how scientists have their hands in the data in such, sometimes probably heavy-handed ways, about how you're making it mold to your model or to your theory.
Well, I would hope that, I mean, I don't, you know, there's certainly, what I meant was, what I wanted was the distance, for something like this, the distance between what goes on in getting the data, making the data, you know, literally transforming whatever the voltage is on your satellite were into this. And then, you know, everything you have to do I wanted to contrast in that other slide, right? Galileo sitting there watching a pendulum swing, right? So it's not, you know, the process of science, you know, hopefully science in its honesty is very detailed about how it went through this. And lots of criticism going back and forth about the right way of doing this, right? So it's definitely true that scientists are going to have their hands in the data and mushing things around, but, you know, there will be this active, this is the power of the community. You know, if somebody's doing something which other people think, oh, you know, that's statistically wrong, that's it, you know, they'll, you know, that will not fly, right? So but it does speak, so I don't think there's not an arbitrariness to it, let me put it that way. That's what I would say. It's not arbitrary in this long route. But it is very much, a product of a community and their values in some sense, like the values of, like, you know, what scientific honesty means, what correct interpretation means. So it's just, it is the workshop. What I want to, I guess in some sense, what I'm trying to show here is the depth to which the workshop has its hands on this.
And do you think that there can be an enhancement with increased transparency along the way to kind of fleshing out more and more of that process?
Well, the process is very transparent internally, I think, you know, because of scientific papers. But I think that the difficulty comes is that, you know, for a non-scientist, there's no way it's going to be transparent, right? There's just so much technical detail and years to understand, like, why this says, oh, you know what, at the beginning of the universe there was a plasma, you know, with this temperature and these species, you know, a non-scientist, just like I don't know anything about genetics, you know, I'm going to have to rely on everything that, and so that is where the sort of objectivist, or sort of, you know, objective materialist, reductionist sort of, what I, you know, where I worry about it is that there's the sense that, like, people want to say, therefore, this is the only truth about the universe. Becomes like, well, there's a lot of work to go from here to there, and you know, we need to recognize how much that it's not so simple, right? We need more sophisticated accounts of the development of the structural invariance, especially when we get to those levels.
Actually, we have to close anyway. Just a funny comment about this. I'm working exactly on this problem right now, and in the fact that you can reproduce that theoretical picture with many different models, there is a huge degeneracy, and breaking that degeneracy is really complicated. So it's not such a beautiful one-to-one correspondence because the models have 6 parameters, and so that is, you know, when you have 6 parameters, everybody wins kind of thing. It's a bit of a problem, right? Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.